Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Shortcut. I'm Jack. This is Greg. We're your hosts this week and every week. Get used to it.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to be talking all about our podcast trends to watch in 2024, sort of some of our ideas about where we think podcasts are heading. We have one. I also used to be a full-time podcaster before I started here at Kapwing. So I've got some insights for you guys. Greg definitely keeps a pulse on, I feel like, more of the podcasts in the marketing world. So I think we have some interesting thoughts for you guys today. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm on week 2 of still putting 2023 on everything. I thought that was like a middle school, like, on your papers, your homework, like getting the date wrong, but
Right.
it has carried into adulthood and now I just type it instead of write it. So week 2 of that, but settling into the new year. Definitely excited. And yeah, I felt like, it is a meta episode, but I felt like we have big plans for our podcast this year. We were sort of like, well, a lot of big plans start with like where we kind of see things are headed. And that's kind of how we landed on the theme of today's episode. So yeah, excited.
Totally. Podcasts, as I feel like everyone knows, I feel like everyone and their mother has a podcast these days. They're just becoming an even bigger and bigger thing. More and more podcasts, I feel like, are becoming, they're becoming even bigger because now you don't just listen to them when you're on a commute. Sometimes you watch them with video when you're at home, which I feel like is like a newer thing. So podcasts popularity, I feel like, is just proliferating. And you know what? Maybe it's time for you to get one, or maybe you already have one, and you got to keep up.
Do you think? Obviously, what we want to prevent here's a metaphor for you. If Shure and all the sort of like Blue Yeti, all of the sort of like podcast brands like for gear, I wonder if they have like a sales spike in the same way that gyms do at the beginning of the year with all the best laid plans of like. And so what we want to do is hopefully help you avoid, that equivalent of a gym membership that just sits around, right?
Yeah.
Let's not go getting podcast gear that goes unused or is like not impactful. But yeah, I do think, like, more seriously, podcasting is in an interesting spot because it's like it has definitely already picked up, I guess, like the doubters, or so to speak, or like people have seen so many podcasts that now you're starting to get the like anti-trend of, well, there's too many of them. We need to mix things up. And I think that there's like some truth to that. But I also think that like a lot of brands should probably just start with like building the muscle if they want to get into podcasting. Like I think trying to come in cold, having maybe never run one before, it's usually not good to like color too far outside of the lines like right at first. I think it's just better to like really get a sense of like having good conversations, having topics that you want to talk about each week, how the prep work, how guest sourcing work, where you're going to publish. Like there's a lot to like build up and just kind of get familiar with. That said, I guess there's like always an expected but when I kind of go on like that, right? But ...
But nothing.
My first, sort of prediction is that I have sort of been swayed to the side of like, we do need to, as marketers, start experimenting more with the formats. And so I think that the traditional interview format it's kind of like the TV formats that have been around since forever. The TV formats that your grandparents even watched. Some formats are so classic that they're not going anywhere, right? So the interview style podcast is not going anywhere either. But I do think you'll see a lot more teams try to branch out with twists and sort of like unconventional takes on what I would sort of maybe what we could bucket this as, this like broader range, is just like conversational format. So it is still conversation. It's still rooted in a couple people talking, but I think brands and teams will introduce a lot more sort of like kind of creative, again, twist flares to this. I saw one recently, so I guess this really reveals like my YouTube watch history and this like nerdy side thing that I'm kind of into. But I do like to be really bad at fighting games. I was like an arcade kid growing up. And so I end up like watching some content from like fighting game creators. And for those that don't know, fighting games is like arcade, like Street Fighter type stuff.
Yeah.
And I saw recently a creator that I liked did this format where he invites like 2 to 3 people on. They have to give a pitch on something semi-serious, but like mostly silly. And then he gives them a grade as if they were sort of like presenting in class. And it's such a fun format. It gives people to like come in with their like sloppily, hastily made on purpose, like slide decks with comedic effect. You have the back and forth of both the guest and the host. The guests have to do like minimal prep work, but at least they have like a really interesting angle coming in because they've already been told in advance, like, hey, basically you're gonna sort of do like a Shark Tank pitch on an idea that you believe. And it was so fun. It was so like refreshing. It was really interesting. I watched another one like right after the fact. I was like, this is so sort of like different.
Yeah.
And that is just like a really great example, I think, of like the whole video was still rooted in them talking back and forth. There was only really this like introduction of, you know, again, like sloppily made, hilarious Google slides and some like some images grabbed that still had the like watermark on them and stuff, like really funny, stuff that people weren't working for weeks on. But it was like so much more interesting, so much more captivating than if they just had sat there and kind of talked like back and forth, right? So again, if you think you can kind of, jump into the deep end, I don't want to put restrictions on anyone. If you're thinking about a podcast and you want to try something kind of off the wall like that right off the bat, I think go for it.
Yeah.
I would say like my experience is it's nice to build that familiarity. And then when you start to look like, how do we up level our show? How do we introduce new things to the show that keep it fresh? And so that we're not always just like, what's the next guest or what's the next topic? Start like adding ideas like that. So I think you'll see like maybe even like game show style things. I think you'll see sort of like maybe like verses or teardowns. Like you and I have had like little segments of like, oh, here's sort of like a point contra to that. So like Greg versus Jack on like an issue or on a topic or something where you play maybe devil's advocate. I mean, there's so many different things you can do. I just think, to TLDR this, it's like podcast still rooted in conversation, probably always will be, but I think like we're really going to shake the tree on interviews this year.
Yeah. I think like a smaller, first way that someone could try to experiment with that is like experimenting with like a 5-minute segment at the top of your episode, or maybe a segment at the end to where like you're not maybe throwing caution to the wind and like completely changing your style, but like maybe adding in some structures to where people like, I don't know, that could add humor and it can also add engagement because people know what's coming if they like the segment. And also like, loyalty because people know what's going to sort of happen. I also feel like there will be more of an emphasis on like edutainment to where like, obviously you're still trying to like as a brand, especially for marketers or B2B content, you're still trying to like generally teach something about the topic, but I do feel like it'll lean more entertaining, humorous. I just feel like people are starting to finally understand that like people who work or are using or like taking in content for work aren't just workers, they're also like regular folks. And so I feel like that maybe we'll see some of that as well.
And I'll throw one last shout out, and I actually can't remember which show I saw this on, but I did see a B2B show recently where the co-host did a small sort of like challenge beforehand, and then the episode was based on their like success or failure on this like mini challenge. Just one last little sort of like fledgling idea of like, that's what I think we mean is like, imagine you and I were sort of tasked with like, how many of like X thing can we do before the next episode? I mean, this might be an idea we'll even add to the hopper. And then like we do it and then we come back and then that's our focal point of the episode is like reviewing how things went and all that kind of stuff. So many little like experiments I think people could try. I just think it's, it's just going to require the confidence to like color outside the lines a bit,
Another trend that I think we will continue to see, or at least continue to see grow in 2024, is video podcasts being the norm, being the default. Right now, probably a lot of podcasts that you watch, especially the larger ones, already do have video components. I think a lot of these larger podcasts with budget know that people want to watch, oftentimes people want to watch podcasts. There's this data I can show real quick that was done by Morning Consult, which was about how podcast listeners or viewers like to consume podcasts. And as you can see, around 32% of Americans preferred video podcasts, and those numbers were larger in younger audiences, which is kind of no surprise. And, you might say, well, that's only a third. But when you remember that like a third of all podcast listeners in the world is like, almost 200 million people, it's like pretty important.
It's a lot.
And I also feel like people just don't know that they like to watch video podcasts yet, because firstly, I think a lot of video podcasts they don't have great video components, number one. I think in 2024, we'll probably see an improvement in actually the quality of video podcasts. I think we'll start to see not only video becoming the default, but an emphasis maybe on using multiple cameras. So you are able to like highlight whoever's speaking, and it becomes more like sort of like actually what you were talking about earlier, Greg, like more like a TV show, actually.
Yeah.
In terms of like how it actually looks as well. And yeah, so those stats are pretty interesting. And also to look at why do people prefer video podcasts? Most of it is because people like to see facial expressions from the hosts and guests. It also helps you focus better. For some people, if you're like a visual learner, it's nice to have a visual component. I'm definitely that way.
Yeah.
And as you can see, there's a few other ones, but like captioning and things like that, which are pretty important. But yeah, I think this will become pretty ubiquitous. And I feel like, I think video podcasts will proliferate and continue to. I can tell you just as sort of a side note. So when I was a full-time podcaster before I started here at YouTube, we did have started here at Kapwing. We did have a video podcast. It was in person. So we did the multiple camera setup. We had multi-cameras. And it was a game changer for two reasons. Number one, we pretty much, I think every single episode ever got more views on YouTube than we did on podcasts. That's because videos on YouTube, you can get recommended, you can get into the algorithm, sort of just people can find you that way. Also, secondly, video is really important because we had like several pretty big viral moments on TikTok, and I feel like it's nearly impossible or much, much harder to do that if you don't have a video. If you're just posting a snippet of an audio podcast on a short form video platform, people aren't going to watch it if it doesn't have a video when they're expecting video. I think.
I think like you have your competitors. I know sort of like showrunners may not think of it that way, but just like, should I spend my attention on this, that, or this? And you have all these people with video clips, and then do you really think your voice and your conversation is so interesting that you can just put like a JPEG of like the show logo or your face, and like that's going to carry it? Tough sell, No,
so. I think like that worked for a while, but I think those days are mostly gone. And yeah, it's just much harder to go viral without video now. And also it's really difficult to grow podcasts, like straight up audio podcasts, really hard. They don't have good algorithms on podcast apps. They don't have a great way to, like, I don't know, look through new podcasts and just hear a snippet and, you know, like, it doesn't really work that way. They haven't quite figured that out yet. And so I feel
Yeah.
like making your own clips with video is, like, really the number one way um, to market your podcast. And so, yeah, probably, like, in the end, I shouldn't say this until later because it's another trend that we're going to discuss.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just video podcasts. If you have a podcast now, audio, and you're not doing video, it's pretty much just as easy to add a video component. I can tell you our behind the scenes, we're not even together, and it's like so easy. We just use something called StreamYard and we record. It's so easy. You can post this on YouTube. You can take the audio and post it on audio only platforms.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way to go.
Yep. And I think, like, for a while, you mentioned something that, like, the biggest players in a space, like the ones that really want to grow, like, no matter what the sort of format is, they are always sort of like brushing up against, like, what's next, obviously, like, first, because they have, I mean, for almost all of the leaders in the space, it's like their full-time job. They probably have like a staff to do it, and they're also just like motivated to go beyond the basics because they've already done that really well. So for the biggest podcast, you did see them go to video, a ways ago, like a while ago. They obviously were probably feeling like some sort of ceiling with like audio only, if they even were audio only, like, at all, to start maybe. I think though, like, a lot of marketing teams, and this is, this can be correct, and this is actually like often correct, are like, well, we don't want to sort of like mimic what this like big budget sort of production is sort of doing. I think though the case can be made that, like you said, like doing video nowadays, like just doing sort of like solid video that looks good and is not some major studio setup that you had like tailor designed and stays up, every day, every week for people to just show up. You could still look good on video nowadays with like pretty minimal effort. And I do think that there was a period where the gap there was like much larger. I mean, certainly, some of the shows even I watched today, I am blown away by like the sets. Like they do keep like raising the bar. But there was a while where it was very clear that the professional shows like look so fundamentally different than like what anyone can sort of cobble together on video on like sort of a more scrappy budget. And I think like between the average video podcast and maybe the absolute top tier like mega shows, with some exceptions, the Joe Rogan podcast is a very big podcast. It seems somewhat casual in terms of its production. Like the set is pretty basic and stuff. Yeah. But some of the shows that I've watched, like gorgeous sets. Yes, there's still a difference, but I think between, your sort of like your average video podcast and kind of that middle rung of like leading podcasts, the gap has closed a little bit because the gear's better, editing is easier, people just learning. I mean, everyone always underrates that like we all learn collectively as people do this and then share back what works and what doesn't. So I think most people have just strictly gotten better at running a podcast that includes video, right? Yeah. Like straight up. So you don't see too many like really grainy MacBook episodes, like MacBook and AirPod episodes much anymore. Most people know how to set up a basic, get up to make it look pretty clean. So we're getting there. We're baby steps, Yeah.
No, we're definitely getting there. I think we might even be there and people just don't know it yet,
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I think another trend to look out for is YouTube becoming a major player in the podcast space. As I already mentioned, like for us, when I had my own podcast, YouTube was our major player and we like played to YouTube. There's a few reasons I think for this. YouTube has been really slow, I think, to the game, but like finally it seems like now they are adding some features for podcasting, most notably RSS. RSS feed is like what you see on your regular podcast apps, like like Apple Podcasts where you'll post your podcast and then it will get like directly downloaded to the person's phone if they follow you, and it's like sort of direct to this feed. And YouTube is finally adding that, adding podcasts to YouTube Music, which is really interesting. I wonder if they'll rebrand that. And I bet they'll eventually, like with a rebrand, I bet they'll eventually have like a podcast homepage. It's like separate from the regular YouTube homepage, which then you have an opportunity for a whole new algorithm to pick you up, which I think could be great to be like ahead of. Furthermore, there was a study also by Cumulus and Signal Hill that said that 28% of weekly podcast listeners say that you use YouTube the most for podcast consumption. I am one of those people.
Same.
I think, as we've been speaking about, YouTube is, I don't know, having video to me is very important. I like to watch them, and that 28% figure is more than the next two competitors combined, Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Which is crazy when you think about, like, because that's their default. It did blow me away.
That's insane, because everyone has an iPhone and we all have that app too. We don't even have to download it.
Exactly.
But so that's pretty insane. I also can tell you that as someone who, I already spoke about the like implications and uses of clipping podcasts for marketing, but also with YouTube Shorts now, YouTube Shorts can be really useful. And now they've added in, I also noticed a feature where you can link a YouTube Short to like a long form video. And so these videos that you've repurposed of your podcast now are directly linked, if you link them when you're posting your short, to your podcast. If it goes viral, people now don't have to go searching for it. They don't have to go, they don't have to click your profile and go look for that specific episode. They can, in like one click or a couple clicks, get directly to the long form content. It's way easier than, discovering a podcast on an audio app and then having to go search for it on YouTube. It's just like many added steps. And so I think that's like, and it's easier than even like going viral on TikTok and someone having to find it. So it's like they're building in this sort of all-in-one platform where I feel like not only can you host your full podcast with video, which is great, but you can market it way more successfully. I imagine that's the reason for this new feature of linking to a long-form video.
I totally agree. And I like used to say that it was funny that I used YouTube so much because, like, again, maybe not until like super recently, but certainly not that long ago, I would say it was a pretty bad podcast platform, like all things considered, like as a podcast platform. So then why did I use it? Like, why was I always still using it for podcasts? And I think it was like a mix of number one, like YouTube can kind of blur the line between, like, yes, you can do sort of like a traditional short, like what most people would think of as like a clip, but podcasters on YouTube are also very smart with like doing like segments. And like you mentioned, when your show is in sort of like a show style, we're now starting to really blur the line between, like, is a 5-minute segment, like, what is that? It's kind of like a YouTube. It's just kind of like a traditional YouTube video. True. It's just in a conversational format. And then I think the other reason was just like, I'm there already. Like, I'm maybe sort of like browsing YouTube in the same way you're kind of flipping through channels, like looking for something. And I could watch or listen to something for 30 minutes if it really grabs me, or I could watch something for 3 minutes and kind of like test the waters. Whereas, like, if I'm on Apple Podcasts, it's like, you enjoy that podcast, you want another podcast? Like, another 45-minute podcast usually. Versus, like, I don't know what I'm in the mood for. I don't know how much time I'm going to commit to this session of like looking through content. So that's just a me personally thing. But like, I was in on YouTube and podcasts like before I think they started adding like actual essential podcast features, and now they've added that, so it's even easier.
No, definitely same. I mean, when I had my own podcast YouTube was our main
Yeah.
platform, and like there was nothing for us, and it was
Yeah.
still successful on YouTube. So yeah, I think it can only get better from here. And also, like, I tend to just generally believe with social media, like, if these platforms are like telling you or like releasing new features and telling you to use them, like, trust them. They're gonna like
Right.
their algorithm's gonna reward you, I think, or be more likely to reward you if your content is good, because they want to also see the tool succeed. So like,
Yeah.
yeah, just like if they're making all these podcast features, like, now's the time.
Yeah. Like they, even more maybe like impartial is like they need feedback.
Yeah,
Like they need feedback. Like yes, certainly from the creators, but like really like and primarily from the users.
yeah,
So they won't king make anyone, right? They're not just gonna like because you're first to the feature or first to the platform or whatever, but they do need the feedback. If you sort of get good feedback, which would be sort of like the engagement and performance and like watch time feedback, basically like the actual user behavior feedback, then yeah, it's like they need it. They need the data. So they find somebody that seems to be getting people to stick around. Why
yeah,
not reward that channel and see what happens? Like they really do need that data. So I think that's how I would see the opportunity is like they need you also. And if you come early, it's kind of like you're one of like fewer options to get that data from. So if your videos perform well, or if a certain style that you're doing that's like new to the platform performs well, I think, yeah, they're going to test you. I think we've seen that across platforms when they introduce something new, you know?
definitely. Definitely, yeah. No, completely agree. I think video podcasts are, if you this maybe I'm being dramatic, you know, as I
Yeah.
sometimes am, but um but I feel like if you don't start adding a video component to a podcast and you have a podcast that is somewhat successful, like, you will regret it soon.
Uphill battle. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you there for sure.
So don't regret, no regrets. Just get on video.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and speaking of like podcast growth, I would definitely say I am still, looking for examples and trying to find where I land on this last sort of prediction or trend that we could see happening this year. Um, I think, we always try to be transparent about whether something's a little more firmed up in our heads or a little more we're like testing the waters and seeing how things go. But the last one is like, I do think brands that are sort of kickstarting podcast, kickstarting video, it's a new channel. They don't want to sort of frankly deal with or want to in some way shortcut is like not an insult, it's the name of our show frankly, but they want to sort of shortcut that like very long grind that it takes to grow a podcast. I think you'll see more brands start to produce shows with creators and specifically like B2B creators, work focused creators as like a co-host. And I think the reason that this could work out is when you get the right person, they got the right audience, they have the right personality, they cover the things that are relevant to your product, your business. It can be a really mutual and good and virtuous like relationship. It's a really good back and forth, I think, between both parties. Like what the creator brings is like tap into their audience. They are, since they built the audience, they're sort of like naturally probably good at like content and content ideas, and they'll bring a lot of like energy and ideas of what to talk about. They'll probably be able to help shape your show. And then what I think the brands can bring is sort of like that distribution, production support, distribution via like, we have a customer base and we'll send this out to our customer list, our newsletter, or prospects, or we'll publish it on our blog, which is maybe a more established channel that we have, right? That's actually something we did pretty well at Shopify. Was like we had this very big blog, and then when we started getting into like podcast and YouTube, we used the blog to try to grow those new shows and those new formats, right? So that's an instance of where a brand might have distribution just in a different way. Like they have like a legacy channel that's very big. And I also think, again, the production help. So we'll put potentially paid spend. We will help with you with the gear. We will provide the setup or the studio or what have you, however far that they take it. So I think that there can be a really good relationship there. I think, like, again, it's, it's not a shortcut in a bad way. It's a shortcut in a good way of like, let's get someone who can bring us an audience from like day one, get feedback on this content from day one, versus that like really, kind of sad, demoralizing. We pour our heart into our first, show with a lot of budget, and then we have like 5 plays on Apple Podcast, and we're like, what the heck, right? So I think we will see a lot more people experiment with that. I'm sort of like, I'm sort of uncertain as to, and I think that this question comes up with working with creators in that more kind of like closer style broadly. Like, an issue with this is that if the show really grows on the back of the creator, they're not going to stick around necessarily forever. I mean, depending on how the agreement is like set up, it may not really be like their show, right? It could be like the show that the brand owns. And so brands will have to sort of figure out and deal with the risk of like, well, when the creator moves on, and in probably most cases, like totally amicably, just like the contract ends, they did 12 episodes, whatever, then they move on to their next project. You have to keep that show going. You have to keep the momentum going. And so that's always a risk with like a personality in anything. I mean, that's been since like the days of TV and movies, right? Like, you lose the lead actress or something, it's like a big deal. So I think they'll have to figure that out. But, do you want that risk down the line, or do you want the risk of like producing the stuff and you have, the same chances that anybody has of the show getting traction, which is pretty tough, not impossible, but always nice to take a couple paths that maybe make your chances easier. So I think we'll see more people take bets on this, but I'm uncertain of like how common it will be, how these kind of agreements with creators and influencers sort of like look like. But I think folks will try it. I think we will see people try it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely really interesting. I feel like it's like, yeah, as you said, great for the brand and great for the creator. I think it also like takes some risk away from the creator, which is nice. Like, you'd say, yeah, I'll do a season for you and you'll get paid this much, and you're not having to yourself like make sure you're getting 30,000 views to make sure you're getting the ad revenue that you'd need for it to be worth your time. And also you're not having to do like, there's always a risk. I feel like nowadays, like, people care less, but I feel like there's always a risk of like over monetizing content. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I remember sometimes in my own podcast a while back, like there would be like 6 ads an episode that we would be reading, and I would be like, wow. And you don't have to do that in this circumstance either, because you're probably only promoting or talking about like one brand. And so it's much less like sellouty potentially.
Yeah. And I think you hint at like what I would expect to see, which is that the creators in that sort of sweet spot of like once they pass a certain audience size, like just kind of more, I guess like strictly traditional like brand deals probably make more sense, because like why would they deal with that like very high effort or higher effort way of like a brand partnership when the pay per post is probably such a great rate because they're very big, versus the folks that are in that sweet spot of like have an audience, they're monetizing. But I think in the B2B world, we've seen folks with like audience sizes that are impressive, but they just have yet to figure out like a way to monetize, so that they still like maybe even have a job, right? Like on LinkedIn, where you'll see a lot of the B2B creator kind of talk happening, many folks with 50, 60, 70,000 followers that like still have their day job, right? So they're still figuring it out. And so maybe this is a way for, like you said, they don't have to maybe like leave the platform that they kind of grew the audience on. If that platform, for instance, doesn't monetize well as YouTube, which like it seems like none of them do, frankly. Like basically no platform monetizes as well strictly from the audience and the views, I think, as well as YouTube does. I think some platforms monetize well when you have a product, I think.
Well,
But
I would
yeah,
argue, actually, from my experience, actually, audio only platforms actually have the best CPMs,
oh really?
like higher
Okay,
than YouTube.
interesting.
Yeah, in my case, just because I think like they're expecting, if you're logging onto an audio only uh thing, you're not getting as distracted. Like there's not like
You're
tons
really
of videos
engaged.
elsewhere. You're not clicking off, so the engagement is like longer. The listen time is longer.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
But sorry.
No. That's a good point. That's a good point. And maybe you'll see folks try that. But I still think in either case, like, it like which regardless of maybe which platform sort of like optimizes better for like CPM, if they can't reach that like full time
Yeah.
breakout level, right? There's still that opportunity of like, oh, this brand deal kind of carries me over, and I can like I can not act like I can do it full time, just in a different way. I'm like not, technically on a full time payroll, but I'm being bankrolled by like a single sponsor while I sort of find my footing, you know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also like as an independent podcaster, I could imagine the partnership being great because like, yeah, in my case, like we had a bunch of brand deals, like sometimes, yeah, like 6 per episode, but we had a whole sales team because we were working with a podcast network. But like
Awesome.
if
Yeah.
you aren't, I think it's way harder to like fill your
To
ad spots too.
manage all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I could imagine it being way easier, yeah, if, big company X comes to you and says like, let's do a podcast together. And you know that every single episode you're making a grand, like
Yeah.
you're probably not going to say no.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I think something that would be interesting to me personally, this will be my last, because this is just like a pure, I'm very curious, is like, you might have a much more interesting relationship with that solo brand in terms of how you're able to create impact. So I spoke with a YouTuber a ways back. We didn't publish this interview, so I won't share their name, but they gave me a ton of detail. I was so appreciative they gave me such a behind the scenes look. But what this YouTuber did that I feel like a lot of people are getting smarter about is he was like obsessed with actually like checking in with brands about like how well the folks he was sending were converting. And then he built up almost like an internal sort of like talking points like sheet when he would do future brand deals, and he had like all this data, which was like so cool because he could then sit down at the table like so informed and be like, hey, in this last brand partnership I was like beating the benchmark by like X% in like terms of the people I was sending were
Yeah.
converting way better. So smart.
Right.
But I think
Yeah.
like, you work for like a B2B business or like a single business where they're maybe willing to share more. You might have these podcasters actually be like, oh, in the last partnership I did, I drove this much in pipeline. I drove this much in revenue, and they're willing to like let me share maybe an approximate or like a percentage of, attribution if they're not willing to share the raw numbers. But imagine like that working relationship going forward of you do this partnership, it goes well, and you can talk about in future deals, like how much like pipeline you drove, right?
Yeah.
If that's your audience, if that's who you want to partner with, that's an amazing thing to bring to the table versus like, oh, I get good CPMs. Like great for you, but it's like hard to probably use that as like leverage for partnerships in the future,
Totally.
So I think that's really cool too. I would love, like, if I were in the kind of like being one of the creators or in that creator space in that way, I would love to see that data. I would be super interested in that.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I think those are our 4 podcast trends to watch in 2024. Let us know in the comments, do you have any predictions for podcasting this next year? Because yeah, we need to stay on top of it, you and I as well. We've gotta stay on top of these trends.
And the earlier you get your predictions out into the world, the less accountability there is, because no one's going to come check back in December about what you were spouting in January.
Yeah, that's so true.
Unless we do like a sneak episode the last week of next December where we go through everybody's predictions, and we will follow up with you.
Yeah.
Just
but thank you guys so much for watching. We are here every week, so make sure to come back to the shortcut as usual. Greg, it's been real, and we will see you guys in the next one.
Take care, y'all.